Hello, my name is Evan Carter and I'm web editor at the Hillsdale Collegian. Today I have the privilege of interviewing David Satter, a Russian scholar and journalist. In 2013, Satter became the first journalist to be kicked out of Russia since the Soviet era. Mr. Satter, thank you so much for your time today. All right, so to get started, what initially caused you to become interested in Russia and Russian culture?
Well, I grew up during the heart of the Cold War, during the heart of the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West. So it was natural, really, to take an interest in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was an alternative reality. It was a country that pretended to have created a social system which was better than what existed in the West. Believe it or not, this claim aroused interest. People wanted to know, well, what really is going on there? And I was no different. In addition, I grew up in Chicago on the South Side. I went to a high school that, strangely enough, offered the Russian language. It was not common in America in the 1960s to offer Russian in high school. But it just so happened that there was a Russian emigre woman who lived in the neighborhood where the school was located and who offered a course in Russian. There was a choice between 5 languages in my public high school in Chicago. Those languages were Latin, French, German, Spanish, and Russian. And my father advised me to take Russian. He said it might be useful someday. I, at that time, could not imagine how it could be useful. I knew that it was very difficult for foreigners to get permission to live in Russia. And those that did lived under special conditions with special permission in guarded compounds. It never occurred to me at the age of 13 that one day I would be one of those people.
Wow, that's incredible. So, so in your most recent book, you called it an experiment where they tried to create a society without God for, you said, the first time, an atheistic society for the first time ever. And you said basically that it failed. Why? How did that come about that they decided to have this experiment of an atheistic society, and why do you think it failed?
Well, the atheism is inherent in the theory upon which the Soviet Union was based, the theory of Marxism, Leninism, and Marxism as a system takes as a fundamental assumption that there is no God, no spirit, no soul, that everything that exists is matter. Human consciousness is a highly developed form of matter. And really everything that exists around us, all of the emotion in the world, all of the feelings in the world, all of the intellect and inspiration is really a product in one form or another of matter and motion. And this very soulless world became the ontological base for Marxist theory of society. And it was on the basis of that theory of society that the Soviet Union was built. So it wasn't so much that the Soviet Union aspired to create a society without God, rather that it was based on a theory which presupposed the non-existence of God.
Okay. And how did being a foreign correspondent lead to you writing books? What was the transition for you? When did you decide that you're going to write about this?
Well, as I began first of all, I made a very, very serious effort to learn the Russian language. And after I had been there for a year, I was quite fluent in Russian, to the point that I had really left English behind. And when it came to doing my work, I was working in Russian, which gave me a huge advantage over many correspondents who were there who did not have the language. And the more I became aware of the country, the more I socialized with people, the more I traveled around and asked people to tell me their stories, their personal stories, the more I realized that this was something very unique, and it had to be captured. It had to be recorded. And I began taking notes for a book. Another thing that happened was that in 1979, the Russian authorities, or the Soviet authorities, tried to expel me. And that attempt was unsuccessful, largely because both the British and the American authorities threatened retaliation against Soviet quote-unquote journalists, in effect intelligence agents, if I were expelled. After that, I was able to stay in the Soviet Union for an additional 3 years, and I felt that I had been given a real reprieve, and I wanted to take advantage of it. I wanted to use that time that I now was granted in the Soviet Union, in this unique country. I wanted to use it in order to really gather information that was necessary to the outside world about what was going on there.
Now, transitioning from that, you were just recently denied access back into Russia. Why do you think that this time you were not backed up by the United States and Great Britain? And actually, could you give a little bit of background on this time when you tried to re-enter, about being expelled, the events that led up to that?
Well, I was given a visa as a correspondent in Moscow. And I was there for 3 months, but it was only when I went to renew the visa that I was informed that my presence on the territory of the Russian Federation, as they put it, in the eyes of the quote-unquote competent organs, which is a phrase that's used to describe the FSB, was undesirable, and I was barred entry. At the time, I was already living in Moscow. I had all my things there. And there was nothing that I did during that 3-month period that would have justified expulsion, largely because, to tell you the truth, I was mostly occupied with getting an apartment, getting furniture, opening a bank account, attending to 1,000,001 kind of administrative details that I had to take care of in order to begin working and functioning in Russia. I think that the real reason was fear on the part of the Russian authorities as to what I might do in the future, and a recognition of what I had done in the past. For many years, the Russians pointed with pride to the fact that not a single American correspondent had been expelled from Russia since the end of the Cold War. And I think they viewed me as an example of just how much they were ready to tolerate. Mm-hmm. But I think with the events in Ukraine, the situation changed. And they began to feel that the degree of liberalism that they had tolerated, and that or rather that they had displayed in order to create a false impression for the outside world, was more than they could afford to continue. I think I was the first sign that things had changed and that they were going to crack down.
And as to why the United States and Great Britain didn't back you up this time, what do you think?
Well, there's a new policy. During the Cold War, it was the policy of the Western countries to retaliate against Soviet correspondents if a Western correspondent was expelled. That was a matter of policy. If a Western correspondent was thrown out of the Soviet Union, a Soviet correspondent was similarly expelled. This was in order to dissuade the Soviets from just freely expelling Western correspondents. Mm-hmm. In the post-Soviet period, the government did not play that role. Of course, I was the first case. And I think it's also a question of the fact that the U.S. government was not willing to make an issue of free speech and the right of people to speak freely from Russia. I mean, there was a pro forma protest, but they did not do anything further. And under those circumstances, of course, the Russians were under no pressure whatsoever to rescind the decision. Whether they would have done it in any case is hard to say.
So you said that when you received the rejection of your visa, that it was received from the competent organs, you said, the FSB.
Yeah.
So would you say that Vladimir Putin knows who you are?
Well, I can't speculate about that, but I mean, it's highly likely. Certainly, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, definitely knows, because he was questioned about it, and he had a ready response. And he's the foreign minister, so I would assume that, in fact, that's a fairly, it was the first expulsion of an American correspondent since the Cold War, and it was a kind of an iconic moment. So I would assume that the Russian leadership had given it thought and was well aware of it.
Now, has that played a part or played a role in the last year? Putin has been very aggressive in his foreign policy. Do you think it's that sentiment among the Russian people, or is there another reason for Putin to invade the Crimean Peninsula and many people say support separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine?
Well, yeah, his reasons are different. I mean, he's not motivated by the population. On the contrary, he's manipulating the population. What's at stake here is an attempt by the leadership to distract the attention of the Russian people from the lessons of what was an anti-criminal revolution in Ukraine. Those lessons are very applicable to the situation in Russia as well. For example, people in Russia could notice that their leaders are just as corrupt and just as inclined to pillage as the deposed Ukrainian leader was. That might inspire people to think, well, maybe what they did we should do here. In order that that thought be driven out of their minds, Putin and the Putin leadership launched an invasion. At the cost of thousands of lives, of course.
Well, Mr. Satter, thank you so much for your time today. This was an excellent interview, and I definitely learned a lot about Russian culture and Russian foreign correspondence, so thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about David Satter, you can read one of his many pieces or read one of his 3 books, the most recent being It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Happened Anyway, Russia and the Communist Party.